Good evening. This is The Big Fight, and I'm Maria Shakil. The United States of America has been rocked by 3 attacks at the start of the new year. In New Orleans, a former U.S. Army veteran drove a truck into a crowd, killing 15 people and injuring several others. In Las Vegas, a car exploded in front of the Trump Hotel, killing 1 person. And a mass shooting outside a New York nightclub left 10 injured. With investigators trying to connect the dots on the New Orleans attack and Tesla blast, people are speculating, analysts are speculating if these incidents are just coincidence or a part of a larger coordinated plot. The FBI, in fact, has said that the New Orleans suspect likely acted alone and was inspired by ISIS. But as of now, they have ruled out a connection between these 3 incidents. But coming ahead of the takeover of presidency by Donald Trump, the attacks pose a big challenge to the new government and the US. Trump, on his part, has blamed the attacks on immigration and Biden administration's policies. Donald Trump, remember, himself survived an assassination bid during the campaign when he was shot at by an individual. While more will be known about these attacks and people behind them in the coming days, they are certain to raise political heat in the run-up to Trump's inauguration on January 20th. So on the show tonight, I ask, how is the new government going to deal with this renewed terror challenge? Joining me on the show is a panel of experts. From Washington, D.C., we have Lisa Curtis, Senior Fellow and Director of Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Irina Tuskerman is Geopolitical Analyst. We have Peter Kuznick, who is Professor of History. And in fact, he is joining us from the American University. We have Adel Malka Nazarin, who is a political analyst. We also have Glenn Carl, former CIA officer, and from India, we have Dr. Katara Kartha, former Director of National Security Council Secretariat. I'm going to begin with you, Lisa Curtis. The recent terror attacks in the US, including the New Orleans truck attack and the cyber truck explosion at the Trump Hotel in Las Vegas, of course, has raised a lot of concerns. But about the timing and the motivations behind these incidents, motives are still not clear. It could very well be a lone wolf attack, but it has created chaos and instability. Why do you think we are witnessing these terror attacks?
Well, thank you for having me on the show. Yeah, this is the first major terrorist attack, the attack in New Orleans in the early morning hours of New Year's Day. This is the first major terrorist attack in the U.S. in nearly 5 years. But I don't think it's surprising. We've been hearing warnings from U.S. officials about the growing threat from ISIS and ISIS ideology for the last year. We have seen attacks by ISIS, major attacks. We saw the major attack in Moscow by ISIS-K, that's ISIS Khorasan, the Afghanistan-based part of ISIS. That was last March. We saw a major attack in Iran in January of last year. And we've seen operatives, ISIS operatives, arrested in places like Europe. We saw a Taylor Swift concert canceled in Vienna, Austria last August. There was an Afghan national arrested in Oklahoma in the United States in October because he was planning an attack on U.S. Election Day in the name of ISIS. So I don't think anybody should be surprised that this attacker in New Orleans was inspired by ISIS. But I do want to draw a distinction. We don't know whether he was inspired online. You know, he was a lone wolf. He sort of was self-inspired by his own reading and research, or whether he had actual contact over social media apps with ISIS operatives, or whether he had contact with ISIS operatives overseas. And I think this kind of information will come to light. And we also need to contrast what happened in New Orleans with Las Vegas. That's a very different situation. One person was killed. That was the driver of the car. This was a highly decorated U.S. soldier, a Green Beret. Did he have a mental breakdown? Was this suicide? We don't know. So we can't connect what happened in Las Vegas with what happened in New Orleans.
One is an army veteran, Shamsuddin Jabbar. The other one is a soldier. These incidents certainly are suggesting that extremists and increasingly these are motivated ideological push. One view was that this is some kind of display of white supremacy. How much do you think these incidents of terror are linked to this, or do you think there is a combination of factors? Ms. Curtis.
I don't think white supremacy has anything to do with these attacks. Number one, we are seeing that the attack in New Orleans was inspired by ISIS. Clearly, this is what we have heard from investigators. We don't know what has inspired the person who took his own life. He actually shot himself before he blew up the Cybertruck. We don't know what happened to him, but again, he was a highly decorated Green Beret soldier. Did something snap? Did something happen, in his personal life? We just don't know. So I don't think anybody is talking about any connection to white supremacists in these latest incidents and the attack that happened in New Orleans.
Okay, Glenn Carl, your thoughts on this? Because, I'm looking at some statistics which show that terrorism is a significant concern, with the Department of Homeland Security, which is reporting that the increase of 357% in domestic terrorism related investigations over the past decade. And they are saying that the majority of these incidents are motivated by radically or ethnically motivated violent extremism.
Well, the statistics you cite are correct, but as Ms. Curtis mentioned or pointed out just before me, the events that had brought us on the air now almost certainly have little to do with the domestic terrorist threat. Domestic terrorist threat being overwhelmingly related to far-right militias and so on. And there was an earlier period when eco-terrorism from the far left was the greatest cause of physical, material, and human harm in the U.S., but that's not the case so much anymore. What we had in New Orleans does appear to be a classic case, which the intelligence community has pretty well understood for almost 20 years now, of an inspired, and I use the word guardedly, it is ironic, jihadist who has been motivated by various grievances and identifications with what appears to be jihadist Islam. I think the Bureau, the FBI, and the intelligence community have done a good job so far in establishing, so far as we can tell now, no links directly of that individual with what remains of ISIS in its various forms internationally. The event in Las Vegas, we know even less. We know less about, but it does appear to have been unrelated to New Orleans, but perhaps to either personal problems, as Ms. Curtis said, or an amorphous association, perhaps, with the domestic problem. But the domestic statistics you cited are a completely distinct phenomenon and problem from that of radical Islam and international jihadism.
Okay, so then Ms. Tuskerman, according to you, why is Donald Trump, the incoming US president, actually talking about all these terror activities having to do with his predecessor's immigration policy?
Thank you so much. I don't think there's any relation between these two incidents and the influx of illegal migrants, although of course, illegal migration carries itself security risks and challenges. And we have seen a number of terrorists who were caught as a result of border security efforts to infiltrate U.S. and we have seen that there's been crime incidents, criminal incidents resulting from illegal migrants being on U.S. soil, and we also have seen that several Latin American countries, in particular, were using the security situation, the lack of resources towards waiting to try to get rid of low-level criminals and basically funnel them through U.S. borders here. All of these issues are accurate, but they're a separate problem and they're not related to internal domestic radicalization. And I think trying to use the current situation to discuss a completely separate scenario is not particularly helpful at the moment. It doesn't make the migration-related problems any less potent or real, but those are two separate and distinct scenarios. Both of the individuals in question were American citizens. They were born in the U.S. They were raised in the U.S. There's no issue related to migration. They both served in the military.
Okay.
If
Okay. Before I bring in Peter, Lisa Curtis, I'm coming back to you. The polarized social climate in the US, many analysts are of the opinion, has created an environment which is perhaps conducive to extremism. And this kind of divisive rhetoric and hate speech is contributing to the radicalization. How much of your views are in sync with these?
Well, I'm not sure that I've really seen that. Look, we just had an election in the United States. The results were accepted. You know, there may be some unhappy people. It was a relatively close election, although not as close as some people thought. So I'm not really seeing a lot of, violence inspired by the political polarization. And again, you know, I've come back to the two incidents. Well, one was clearly an attack in New Orleans, and the person that conducted that attack was clearly inspired by a foreign ideology by ISIS. In the other case, we just don't have the facts yet. And, you know, as the previous person explained, both of these individuals were born in the United States. The issue has nothing to do with immigration in this case, even if, you know, the issue of illegal immigration is a valid political issue. It doesn't relate to this attack and this other incident that we saw in Las Vegas. But I think, you know, what's important here is how critical the FBI is to thwarting these attacks, and then conducting the follow-up investigations to prevent further attacks. And so we just can't afford to see the good work of the FBI politicized, or the personnel of that organization denigrated. And I think if, you know, Kash Patel is confirmed as FBI director, which all signs look to be that he will, he'll have a huge responsibility to bring the staff of the FBI together, to boost morale, to get them focused on the mission of protecting the United States. And he has a good record of eliminating other terrorist threats to the United States. But, you know, taking over the FBI, it will be a whole new level, a major responsibility to maintain that organization's focus on preventing these kinds of attacks against U.S. citizens.
Okay, so in terms of the lessons being learned from these high-profile, events, how does it really impact the incoming inauguration ceremony on 20th and the nature of security that will be deployed, Mr. Kucinich, for Donald Trump's inauguration?
There's always extensive security around the inaugurations. I mean, there will be, and given the polarization in the United States and the assassination attempts on Donald Trump during the campaign, there was already going to be extremely heightened security around this inauguration. So that's already in place. What unites these two incidents is that they both were in the army. They both served in Afghanistan.
That's right.
They both, at various times, were at Fort Bragg, but they were very, very different in their views. One was a supporter of ISIS, and the other was a devoted supporter of Donald Trump. There's a very interesting report about extremism in the military that was conducted by the University of Maryland. And they looked at extremist incidents between 1990 and 2024. And they found that 51% of the extremists who carried these out were affiliated with militias, right-wing militias, that another 32% were white supremacists, and that a little more than 6% were affiliated with Islamic extremism. And so we've got a real problem. And if you put a Kash Patel, somebody who's already said he would like to use the FBI to get a vendetta against Trump's enemies in charge of the FBI, they're going to be overlooking the threat of right-wing extremism and focusing elsewhere again. So I think Kash Patel would be a disastrous choice. He might get confirmed, but I think it would be a big mistake, and we take the eye off the ball again of where the sources of extremism are, because that threat is growing, as is ISIS growing again internationally at this point.
So if we were, since you're talking about the attacks or extremist activities which happened in the 1990s to now, if we were to look at and compare previous ones to now, then in terms of tactics, target, and impact, what do you think are the differences and similarities?
Is that a general question?
Well,
Yes, Mr. Kuznick.
There had been a threat from left-wing extremism in the past, but most of that went back to the 60s and 70s. The more recent threat has been from right-wing extremism, but given the ideological proclivities of the FBI and the intelligence community, they were not focused on the threat from right-wing extremism. Now they're much more alert to that. But then there's also this, I don't know where we put in terms of the political spectrum, the Islamic extremists who also represent a threat. So, but we're living in a very violent world. There's a lot of concern in the U.S. about the innocent victims who in New Orleans, and that's appropriate. But how many people were killed in Gaza yesterday? 5 times, 6 times as many as were killed in New Orleans. We don't see their faces on American television. We don't see their family members who are more crying over this. But this is violence is carrying out all over the planet. And Jimmy Carter recently passed away. Well, in 2019, he said that the United States is the most violent country in the history of the world. And Jimmy Carter is appropriately respected and honored now, but the United States is behind a lot of the violence that's taking place right now. And the fact that it would blow back to the United States, especially among people involved in the military who've been trained in violence, in part at least, is not a big surprise. We have to find different ways to solve our problems domestically and internationally.
So, Lisa Curtis, do you see the timing of these attacks just before Donald Trump's oath just coincidental, or is it a possibility that the perpetrators sought to capitalize on the attention which is surrounding the inauguration?
Look, I don't really see connections between the 3 attacks at this moment. It's very early. I know very little about what happened in New York. But as of now, it looks like 3 isolated incidents that are happening. It is the new year. A lot of times, this kind of violence does happen in the new year. We know that ISIS put out a call for people to attack during the New Year's celebrations. And, there are many different factors that could be contributing to these 3 different events. But I do want to make the point on the links to foreign policy, particularly of the New Orleans attack, and this person that looks like he was inspired by ISIS ideology and the fact that we see a rising ISIS threat globally. And I think what it shows is the Trump administration really cannot ignore the Middle East and Central Asia. It cannot afford to look away from what's happening in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. These are places where ISIS forces operate. And if the U.S. does not continue counterterrorism operations, if it does not continue to collect intelligence to monitor these threats, they're only going to get worse. So I think, if anything, this happening so close to the Trump inauguration does two things. One, of course, they're going to step up security for the inauguration. There's going to be a lot more concern about protecting that event. But number two, it's going to remind the incoming Trump team that as much as it may not want to, have troops overseas or continue to focus on these very difficult, complex problems in the Middle East, it has no choice, because they always tend to have an impact on the United States and U.S. Homeland Security.
So, Adil, are you seeing these incidents perhaps, impact the event itself, Donald Trump's inauguration, and how do you think it will force the Homeland Security to redraw its counter-terrorism strategies?
So I do happen to, it's very important to point out that both men who carried out these incidents, I don't believe they coordinated anything, although that remains yet to be seen. They did actually display financial difficulties before. The gentleman in New Orleans had actually showed erratic behavior prior to the attack. He also had expressed financial difficulties. The guy who carried out the attack in Las Vegas had just broken up with his wife, I think, because she had accused him of infidelity and had other issues. I think that there's a lot of elements that go into this. I think that, to be frank, just to address the other gentleman's comment regarding Kash Patel and the FBI, I have to say, the FBI is like God, if you want to talk about it. It's omnipresent, and it's not just going to focus on right-wing extremism, left-wing extremism, radical Islamic jihadism. It's going to focus on everything. And unfortunately and sadly, the only way to truly monitor every single person's mental health is if we have a scenario like Minority Report, where there's pre-crime. And I really hope that our country doesn't come to that. I hope the world doesn't come to that. But I think that with the advancement of AI, it's going to be a lot easier to use unique, intelligent algorithms in order to predict through online, behaviors. And this goes into the Homeland Security strategy, kind of refocusing and shifting a new strategy for countering terrorism and other kind of attacks to American security at home and abroad, using AI in a healthy way and a very smart way, along with different patterns of behavior, some historical context, to be able to predetermine and to put an end, to kind of put the kibosh on any kind of potential attacks. That said, I don't think it's going to be possible to, you can use Neuralink, for example. If you have every person installing Neuralink in their minds, you'll definitely be able to tell who's contemplating carrying out an attack. But I think Homeland Security is going to have to definitely, I think they're doing a good job, but I have to say, I think with the incoming administration, and if Kash Patel is in fact confirmed, I think it's going to give the FBI a very much needed boost. I think it's going to help really undo, to a certain degree, years and years of damage that has been done and weakened the FBI as an organization internally due to being more relaxed, to be honest with you. I think America was unfortunately a little less safe over the past few years due to the FBI and not necessarily being as tough on taking threats seriously. Threats are taken seriously, of course, but I think that now with a incoming, Trump administration for a second time, with hindsight being 2020, learning from their past mistakes, and with the unfortunate series of incidents that we've seen in America and also, threats abroad, that there's going to be a renewed focus on, in fact, using the technologies that are at our available to us through AI and other brilliant minds that are working in the U.S. Against threats at home and abroad, to really hunker down.
Here would be that these are homegrown. I'm looking at the profile of Shamsuddin Jabbar. US citizen from Texas, enlisted in the Army in March 2007, worked in human resource and IT. He deployed to Afghanistan from February 2009 to January 2010 before transferring to the US Army Reserve in 2015. And the fact is that he is an army man. Another incident which happened similarly has the background of a soldier. So we are looking at those who are supposed to be custodians of the country are now being involved in incidents of this nature.
You're asking me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, see, I think the most disturbing in this is one of them is a serving person, right?
Yes.
He's a serving. So I think I would really, in fact, I just wrote about this on Peter Koznick's point, that the number of the option to use force by the US has increased substantially. So there are wars everywhere. More and more US service people are involved in active wars. So obviously the danger to yourself is much more. I mean, overall, also you look at the attack on the Trump Towers. Here is a Green Beret who is a special forces guy, and he shoots himself and doesn't actually kill anybody else. If he wanted to, he could have killed a hell of a lot more. These are guys who handle explosives all the time. So there's something really strange about that attack. He took a gun and shot himself. That was that. The point I'm trying to make, which is that I think overall our sense of values have gone down because your global conflicts have doubled in the last 5 years. 200,000 people dead, and the number of refugees have tripled. Nobody cares. I mean, so if that is the level of your value system, then you are going to find erosion in all militaries who are involved on the ground. I mean, what kind of moral values and the things that the soldier fights for? The things what he fights for is nation, country, and a set of values that he holds. Now, if those values are eroded, you're going to find more of this kind of activity, this kind of mental, stress on these people who are otherwise, amazing people. I mean, that gentleman was actually, I was told, this is what I read, that he was collecting for children in Afghanistan. He was collecting, charity. He was doing some kind of charity. So here is a person who's driven to this. So I think there is indifference to death globally, because as Peter Koznick says, where are those people who are dying in Gaza? People are dying in Afghanistan. Refugees are moving. So in that background, you have to expect that violence overall. I mean, that Christmas bombing in Germany was a man who renounced Islam. And let me point out to you one more thing. For those of you who are saying that Islamic threat, the Islamic State, the threat is immense. This ISK, the Islamic State, claimed an attack on January 1st in Somalia. It has not claimed anything. It has not said anything about this. Islamic State in Afghanistan, the Khorasan, is split into at least 6 groups. So that's a different, I think that the propaganda that is being unleashed is linked to the vulnerability of these people. That's all I'm saying.
Dr. Karta, in terms of the availability of the material which forces radicalization, because there is a rise in online radicalization that we are seeing, do you think that dissemination is not being monitored properly? And we are talking about US, which has ensured that its borders are not really porous.
It is, yeah. Propaganda is obviously that kind of, dissemination of stuff is a dangerous thing. But I'm still coming back to the point that it works only in certain places. It works only if the sense of grievance is there. If there is a sense of grievance, it works. If somebody is, happy and he's not going to be looking at this kind of rubbish. And that is a lesson for us as well, for all of us, that you need to address serious concerns. You need to reduce the willingness to use violence by the state. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay, Glenn Carl, Do you see some kind of relation if we were to connect the dots, the assassination attempt on Donald Trump and these incidents or rise in terror attacks that we are seeing this year?
Well, we have to distinguish, I think, between the several incidents that we're talking about. It's true that the increasingly tense polarization. When I say it's true, I think this has been empirically demonstrated. I'm not asserting this. That the increasing political polarization in the United States of the past decade in particular, but progressively over the past 40 years or even longer, but certainly the last decade, has led to increases in extremist actions and which have spilled over to some violence, generally from the far right. A point made several minutes ago I wanted to weigh in on it, which is relevant now. I was one of the few people responsible for writing the threat assessments for the United States, specifically with regard to terrorism and extremism, 20 years ago now. But there's no change. And the disturbing point is that the assessment by the FBI, the CIA, the Department of Homeland Security, all relevant parties, documented a rise in far-right militias and right-wing militancy. However, and that was the greatest threat to blood and treasure in the United States. However, I must say, the Republican administration forbid the intelligence community from stating that because that was characterized by them as a politically partisan statement. It was not. It was an objective assessment of fact. We were allowed to say that Islamic extremism was the #1 threat. Now, Islamic extremism is a threat, but domestically it was not the #1. So there's been a conflation and a confusion of the actual assessments of the threat over decades. The event in Las Vegas may be associated with that phenomenon of domestic issues, but we don't know, and that might be an unfair assessment or assertion to make because we do not know. The New Orleans event clearly is one inspired by the propaganda and the ideologies of the jihadists, the Islamic extremists. But that's a separate issue.
Okay. But Glenn, since you talk about those assessment notes that you've made, one report that I was reading suggested that lone offenders and small groups perhaps pose the greatest threat, and they're often motivated by ideologies that emphasize hatred and violence towards specific groups. In case of these attacks, they have chosen to attack, places where there were revelers, party goers. Why do you think we witnessed this nature of attack? And also in front of a Trump hotel. The message, of course, was also going to the incoming president.
Well, I'll address the Trump hotel issue second, although I think I've attempted to distinguish that in my previous comments. But why do terrorists attack the innocent? Well, that's sort of the entire point. And I'm not being facetious here, or I hope reductionist. The point of terrorism is to make people afraid, to terrorize them, and to hit an easy target. It's often inchoate. It's not particularly coherent. They aren't trying to kill someone who, if they eliminate that person, will then no longer have a particular policy. They are striking at a society, at amorphous and sometimes specific grievances. One of the previous speakers talked about, alluded to American foreign policy actions, often which have been military. Well, that has angered many and aggrieved many people. But it's the response, the terrorist response, has been less precise than that. It's a reaction against and a strikeout against things American and American society because of these perceived and in often cases accurate assessments of the actions and their consequences, the American actions consequences. But that's it. And the other point, very important, that you touched upon, is for years the United States, during the quote war on terror, went after specific organizations, terrorist organizations, in the belief by the administration of the time that to eliminate Al Qaeda would solve the problem. Well, eliminating Al Qaeda did address the problem of Al Qaeda to a large extent, but almost had nothing to do with the fundamental problem, which is an ideological, theological, cultural, and sociological one of reaction against Western norms and Western actions, and the struggle of a more traditional society and belief system to adjust to a globalized, technological, modern world. This is what the lone wolf, the individual, the inspired people are reacting to. It's a much exponentially harder issue than going after a specific organization. But that's what the counterterrorist community rightly came to assess long ago, but which is not in any way what the incoming Bush administration believes. They have a much more reductionist, simplistic view, and which will create all sorts of problems while solving few.
Okay, so Ms. Tassulman, if I may ask you, what do you think would be the immediate challenge for Donald Trump's administration, given the nature of these terror attacks which have happened?
First of all, of course, the investigation itself is complex enough as it is. And we are seeing some very strange feedback around it. For instance, ISIS itself did not take credit for the attack by its New Orleans admirer, which is unusual because ISIS likes to take credit for terrorism. They like to draw attention to their actions. It's also interesting that the FBI has ruled out links between the two incidents and said at a very early stage that the New Orleans attack was a lone wolf attack. But what does that really mean in practice? It is entirely possible for two individuals to have their own agenda in carrying out violent incidents, whether it's a suicide or whether it is an attack or a mass attack. But it is still possible for those attacks to be coordinated if these two individuals were in touch with other entities, whether state or non-state actors. And the Las Vegas attack in particular raises many questions. Why would someone rent a Cybertruck to a luxury Airbnb for cars, Turo, stuff it full with the firecrackers, very inefficient form of bombing, shoot himself and then blow up the car by the Trump Tower. At the very least, this is not simply a suicide. There's some sort of a message. What that is, we are yet to decipher. But it is worth noting that both attackers served at the same military base. They both had years of active duty behind them, and they both rented their vehicles on the same day and through the same car rental company, the Turo, this Turo exchange. So I think all of these things should not be dismissed out of hand. I think there is a sort of propensity in our security agencies to quickly try to relegate everything to neat packages such as lone wolf attacks and to dismiss high-level coordination or inspiration, or the fact that we have had foreign malign influence from state and non-state actors work in various direct and indirect ways, some of which can be complex, sophisticated, and escape immediate detection.
Okay.
So one of the challenges for Trump is not only to deal directly with terrorist incidents, but also with the agencies and the overhaul of these agencies and ensuring that individuals there are qualified, that they are not ideologically biased in favor of one group or the other, and that they're prepared to examine full weight of the evidence, no matter where the evidence ultimately leads. And I think we have a problem with that. I think we have a problem with both the so-called left and the so-called right. I think the polarization is just one dynamic that we're looking at. The other part of the dynamic is the breakdown in ideologies, the fact that there is no
Okay.
clear far right or far left anymore, and the fact that we have various extremist ideologies working together quite frequently. We see Islamists partnering with the so-called far left and far right, and we're seeing conspiracy theories proliferating across the aisle.
Okay, so Dr. Karta, how much does this have to do with Donald Trump's foreign policy?
Well, the fact that it seems there's a lot of people who don't like Elon Musk and there's a lot of people who don't like Donald Trump. I mean, that's a given in terms
very
of
extreme views, as we say, extremely polarized America that will be seeing the inauguration of the new president.
The immediate thing which I thought of is that, Tulsi Gabbard, who is completely against the whole surveillance package, which Donald Trump refers to as the deep state, that is going to, I think, she's not going to be able to achieve that kind of, stepping back from surveillance. If anything, you're going to get worse. So that is one casualty. Second is the fact that he's got all these multiple issues up front, including, of course, the Biden administration's supply of missiles to Ukraine, which upended that whole thing. He's got the terrorism issue. So it suddenly seems that Trump has got multiple, crises on his hands as he comes into power. So that's not a good thing. I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying this is what seems to be the case. But I don't see this, sort of changing his foreign policy priorities. He's, I think the other speakers know better. He's transactional. He knows what he wants. He knows what the business wants. But as I said earlier, and I like one of the things he said, which to me makes more sense, is end the wars that the US is involved in. That itself will create a difference in the way people perceive the US, which in turn leads to a reduction in the kind of external violence attacks. So this is completely, let's face it, there are just too many wars going on in which the US troops are on the ground.
Okay. Okay, I have just enough time for final comments from Peter Kuznick and Adele. Starting with you, Mr. Kuznick.
I think we have to recognize the fact that the United States is awash in guns, that there are more guns than there are people in the United States. We also have a lot of mental instability, a lot of people who suffer from mental problems. And you put that together with the world that Dr. Kartha was just talking about, a world in which violence is used, especially by the United States, but also by others, to solve problems. And it sends a message. Now, Donald Trump might pull the United States support out of Ukraine and help end that fighting. And he might then, if you look at his advisors, then focus more on Iran and China and increase the tensions with those countries. But in any case, Donald Trump's rhetoric tends to be not only nationalistic, but also quite violent. And his immediate response to the New Orleans the New Orleans terrorist attack was to blame it on illegal immigrants. And even this guy was born in Texas and raised in Texas and educated here, served in the military. So that kind of polarizing rhetoric is very, very dangerous at this moment. And if he does carry out his promised policy of sending tens of millions of undocumented immigrants out of the United States, this is going to become a much more tense country. So we have to step back from the way we're looking at problems. Diplomacy has become a dirty word in the United States, but we need diplomatic solutions to the situation in the Middle East, to Ukraine, to the arguments over Taiwan, the South China Sea. And if Trump does that, but the thing is, nobody knows what direction Trump is going to go. And he could be an oracle for peace and settling these things in a way that would lower the tension in the United States and globally, or else he could be the other Donald Trump. And if you look at the people he's nominated and appointed, they're people who are, many of them are neoconservatives who look for military solutions. And then some of them are anti-militarists. So again, we have no idea. We're trying to push Trump in one direction, but there are other people trying to push him in a different direction. And you put all those things together, and it's not surprising that there is violence. It's not surprising that there are terrorist attacks, because there's a lot of discontent. And that was reflected in much of the vote for Donald Trump. People have grievances, and some of them do not look to solve them in a peaceful and rational way, and that creates dangers.
Okay, Adele, one view certainly is that Donald Trump doesn't mince his words, but his unpredictability also makes him appear as a tough administrator. So someone who can actually ensure that America is a safe place. And all these incidents of attacks can be tackled strategically and prevented in future.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Can you hear me, by the way? Is the volume okay?
Yes, it's perfectly fine, Adele. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. I happen to think that, yeah, his unpredictability, as we call it, has been used as has been a sore spot before, but I think that he's this time around able to use it to his advantage. Again, hindsight is 2020. I think he's learned a lot from his mistakes in the past, and I think that you always want to stay a few steps ahead of those who are trying to take you down. Enemies within the country. I think that whole, the left-wing narrative of gun violence and guns, guns don't kill people, people kill people. Guns are not going anywhere. They're part of the American fabric, like it or not. The country was founded with guns, and I think that that's not really the issue at hand here. It's obviously you can use knives, you can use explosives, IEDs, which were used. You can use cars to kill people. So you can't ban those. I don't think that's the issue. If I were the FBI or CIA, I wouldn't focus as much on the fact that they came from the same military base. I think it's a distraction. I think there's a lot of distractions here. What I would do is I would focus on, honestly, what's a lot of different things, but let's just say I focus on the online rhetoric. I wouldn't take these things so lightly. The professor is absolutely correct that there is a mental health epidemic in this country. I think that it's a global phenomenon. It is definitely lending itself to right-wing and left-wing radicalism. There is a marked rise in right-wing terrorism too, if you want to talk about it, which it definitely is. But there's a lot more people who are unfortunately, let's say, impressionable. And I think that the rhetoric coming out of the administration is going to be very important. I wouldn't, do a flowery kind of rhetoric either. No need to put a rose-colored, lens over the situation and try to talk about, kumbaya and peace and love. That's not the situation here. We're at war. I think what Trump was saying, honestly, with regards to immigrants and the threat from within, is he was foreshadowing what's to come. There are sleeper cells in the U.S. They are definitely waiting to be activated. I would really be, I say I'm worried about America. I think that our intelligence agencies need to be really putting their ears even closer to the ground, to social media, more so than they've ever done before. And I'm certain it's going to be done because these sleeper cells, so-called, you want to call them lone wolves, they are here. A lot of them are anti-American. Yes, they did come through our porous borders. Some of them came in legally. Some of them were born here, as we saw today, and became radicalized. So there's going to have to be a renewed focus, honestly, on using algorithms, AI, to be able to detect these online threats. So I think that's the thing that we can look for.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Tara Karta, Glenn, Adele, Peter Kuznick, Irina, and Lisa Curtis. Of course, we have come to the end of this discussion on the big fight. That's all from me. Thanks so much for watching.
Thank you.